this video, we'll be looking at data collection techniques, and specifically qualitative data collection techniques. Qualitative data can generally relate to concepts, opinions, values, and behaviors of people who are embedded in a specific social context. And because of this, qualitative data cannot be reduced to numbers easily. And in fact, it's not about quantifying how many people have a certain opinion, but rather actually understand as much as possible, the broad spectrum of opinions that might exist. And there are different ways in which we can collect this type of data. The most common one is through verbal data, so things such as interviews and focus groups. But it can also be visual data, for example, getting people to take a picture or draw something, looking at pre-existing text, such as policy documents or news articles, as well as collecting more naturalistic data. So this means collecting data in a more natural way, where participants are not disrupting their day-to-day life as much as in other forms, like interviews, for example. And they don't have to rely as much on memory to recall events, experiences. And there are two common types of naturalistic data collection. One is participant observation, where the researcher observes the participant in their social context and takes notes without actually interacting with the participant. And then diaries, where the participant takes notes regularly on a particular topic that's of interest to the researcher. But for this video, we will be focusing on interviews and focus groups, understanding what they are, how to conduct them, and how they are different from one another. So let's start with interviews. Somebody can maybe misunderstand interviews as a conversation, and in some ways it is, but it's more than that. It's a conversation with a purpose. Which means it's a systematic means of gathering data on people's understanding, values, and interpretations of a particular topic. And there are different values that come with doing interviews. It allows to avoid that narrow, predefined response that you get if you are administering a questionnaire or surveying people. It tries to access also thinking closer to the form that is naturally taken when thinking about a particular topic. And it allows for nuances and ambiguities and contradictions of thoughts and feelings to actually emerge in this conversation. Kvale sets out seven different stages of interviewing. The first one is called thematizing, and this is where the why and the what need to be clarified. This means you start off with a research question, but you need to think about what is it exactly that you want to explore? What's the topic? What's the purpose of your research? What will you cover in your interview? And that leads then to the second stage, which is designing, whereby the researcher develops an interview guide, which is a series of basically the questions and topics that you want to cover in your interview, so that every interview is roughly the same to one another. How similar these interviews are from one another will depend on how structured the interview is, and we'll see that in the next slide. Once you have a purpose and a topic for your interview, and you have a set of questions with your interview guide, it's then time to start interviewing, so the third stage. Interviewing is not easy. Like I said, it's a conversation with a purpose, but in order to let people's perspective emerge in a more natural way, you need to practice interviewing. And there's a lot of practice that is needed for this. And that's why we always encourage students and people who do interviews to do a pilot, ask a friend, ask a fellow student to answer questions and take part in your interview so that you can refine and practice yourself. Also, one other important aspect to remember when interviewing is that you need to build rapport with the participant. You need to build that sort of personal relationship with them in the sense that they feel comfortable enough to open up to you. Once you've completed your interview, the next stage is that of transcribing. It's often advisable to do this as soon as possible after the interview has been completed. This is because the interview is still fresh in your mind and you can remember more of the nuances and details what happened in the actual conversation. Now, you might be recording the interview with a voice recorder or your phone, or you might be just taking notes as the participant speaks without actually having an audio recording. How you record it will depend on how you transcribe your interview. This can be in full or maybe just notes. If you're doing it just on notes, it is even more advisable that you write down as much as possible of what you remember right after the interview. Once you've transcribed your interviews, then it's time to start analysing. Now, analysing is not a separate stage in the sense that it only starts once you've transcribed. It's something that is constant and ongoing. As you conduct different interviews, you'll start to notice, as people speak, recurring topics, recurring themes that emerge. And this is an ongoing process that's very iterative. As part of that, the sixth stage is verifying. And this is where Quale argues that you need to be able to check that how the data that you've collected is actually answering your research question and what you'd set out to explore. This also includes, though, checking with participants that how you've interpreted their data is actually correct. One way of doing it is by sending them a summary of your analysis and asking them whether they agree with your interpretation of the data that you've analysed from them. And then once you've analysed and verified the data, then it's time to actually report it and write it up, be it in your project, in a paper. And here it's really important to actually use quotes as part of the evidence that you're providing. It's not enough to just summarise what you found, but also provide data in the form of quotes and use them to support the interpretation that you've given to the data. So as I mentioned, there's different types of interviews depending on how structured you want to be. And there are mainly three types of interviews: structured, semi-structured, and non-structured. Structured interviews are, to an extent, similar to a questionnaire, but they're a lot more personal because obviously you are asking these questions face-to-face to someone. So based on a topic guide of questions, you ask the same exact question to every single participant. And not only the questions are identical, but the question order and the wording of the question remains the same for each participant. And this is how a structured interview is somewhat similar to a questionnaire. Using this type of interview is very useful when we are interested in very specific information and we want to make sure that we're able to capture the same information across all of our participants. Semi-structured interviews also have a topic guide, but it's not applied as rigidly as in a structured interview. So there is some consistency, but the researcher is more sensitive to the emerging topics and discussions that are happening in the interview itself, which means that you might adapt the order in which the questions are asked. If, for example, a participant mentions something at the beginning that you had planned to cover at the end of the interview, you can start covering that topic earlier on. You can also change the wording, for example, to match the wording of the participant so that they understand the language. And more importantly, you're free to follow up on things that people mention. And this might be that you are following up on things that aren't covered in the topic guide. For example, you might be probing, asking participants, can you tell me more about this? Can you give me an example? How did it make you feel? Or clarifying to make sure that you are understanding what people are saying. Because of this, the interviews might not all be exactly identical to one another. Non-structured interviews, instead, have a very open topic guide, in the sense that the interview does have an overarching topic that the researcher is interested in, but the conversation is much more free flow to happen. So the interviewer just gives very general prompts rather than directed questions. And this is a useful technique to use when the researcher is really interested in the naturalism of data, rather than trying to get an answer to a particular topic that the interviewer is interested in. Non-structured interviews are generally a lot more lengthier. They take a lot more time than other types of interviews, because the participant will have very long, uninterrupted streams of speech. Because the interviewer will just kind of talk about what their opinion or their experiences are, but they might sometimes feel like it's more of a conversation rather than me answering questions to an interviewer, for example. And this means that it can result in data that is very diverse between different interviews, and therefore it makes it a lot harder also to analyze, because there is less coherence between the different interviews to make it a single data set. So the semi-structured and non-structured interviews give you here some examples as to why I mentioned earlier quantifying answers for particular questions, trying to understand how many people have a particular opinion. Reducing to numbers is not an ideal and is not the goal for qualitative data. It's more about getting this broad perspective on a particular topic. So when we set out to do interviews, once you have a topic guide, so a general structure of what you want to cover in the interview, there are a few things that you need to prepare in advance. First of all, you need to think about location. Now, you want this to be a neutral, generally public space. This is for your own safety, especially if you're interviewing people that you don't know, that are strangers. Obviously, you don't want to go into someone's home if you don't know them, for your own safety reasons. So I often recommend students to go to a quiet cafe, maybe a room in a library that can be bookable. Sometimes you can use participants' own context. For example, if it's an office where there'll be other people, in a meeting room, for example. And this might be useful in order to see the participant in their specific environment and unpack particular dynamics that might happen there. A way around this, if you can't, is to ask participants to bring any useful material with them at the interview. So if you're looking at how, for example, they manage communication for work and personal reasons, you might ask them to bring their laptop with them at your interview. The other thing you need to prepare for an interview before you actually go in and do the interview is materials. So you want to have your interview guide. You want to have a voice recorder if you're planning to record your interviews. And that means also having spare batteries, because voice recorders will stop on you and you might miss having recorded the information. Sometimes some researchers will have 2 voice recorders, one as a backup. And then, of course, you need to prepare an information sheet and a consent form to bring with you at the interview. When you're actually sitting in front of the participant, this might be face-to-face or even over Skype or a similar tool, for example, you want to be able to introduce yourself and explain why you are interested in talking to them. Give them an overview, even if you've already done so in an email, for example. Just repeat what is the purpose of this interview. Set expectations about how long the interview will be, how the data will be treated with confidentiality, and repeat to them that there are no right or wrong answers and they're free to share their own opinions and perspectives on the topic. Once you've done this, it's generally good practice to provide them with the information sheet and allow them to read through it carefully and ask any questions they might have. Once they've read the information sheet, then they should fill out the consent form. And only at that point, you should then ask if you can explicitly ask them whether you can record the conversation. And at that point, you can start recording the conversation. Do not start the voice recorder before that. So then this is when the interview actually really starts. And like I said, an interview is a conversation with a purpose. So if you're having a conversation with a friend, you don't jump into the conversation with like hard, difficult questions unless you have a very long-term kind of relationship with them. You've known them for a long time. With an interview participant, it's generally the first time you've met them, so you want to ease them off in the conversation. This sets the tone, helps them put at ease, gets them used to talking to a stranger. So oftentimes it's nice to start with an easy question, something that participants feel they are confident in answering, and perhaps is maybe a broad question, such as walk me through your typical day, or maybe double checking some facts that you know about that participant. There is no reason why you shouldn't be able to do some small talk or appropriate humor at this stage of the conversation and the interview, again, with the purpose of putting them at ease. And then once that's set, start moving into the more controversial or personal questions and kind of digging deeper into the topic of interest. Now, the questions in general need to be open-ended, neutral, and worded clearly. So, for example, if you're asking someone about present, past, and future experience, always start with the present experience because it's something that they're living now, and then ask them to think about how this happened in the past, for example, which requires them to remember and recall experiences perhaps from a long time ago, and then speculate how this might go forward in the future. Once you've covered all your questions and your topics, at the end of the interview, it's always really good to ask the participant if there's anything else they would like to add. This allows them to cover something that they were hoping to share with you, but you hadn't considered asking them, but also clarify something that they might have said earlier on in the interview and they've changed their mind. And then, of course, once you're done, thank them for their time. So there's all sorts of different questions that can be asked in an interview. So I've listed several here. And these are not necessarily in the order you would ask them, but it's just a way of thinking about how you might cover different questions. So you can have a grand tour of question where we like I said earlier, you ask the participant to describe a typical day, for example, or a mini tour where you ask them to describe a particular smaller process, like how do you take calls if somebody works at a call center. Ask people to tell a story or a recent example. I really like the use of asking them for recent examples. It generally offers good quotes. It allows participants to expand a bit more, talk more freely. And once they introduce a recent example, then you can start asking them for exceptions for when something happens. There's also questions about clarifying things. So clarifying whether this is what participants had expected, clarifying if this is something that this is how people had understood something. But also asking them how generalizable their perspective, their opinion, or their experience is. It's important for interviews to actually make sure that the interviewer and the respondent are using the same language. So if you're unsure how a participant is interpreting a particular word or expression, make sure to follow up and ask them, what does system mean here? How do you interpret this? Or another way of doing it is to repeat and rephrase what the participant has said to double check your understanding. And one very important question in interviews, that is a follow-up question generally to what participants have said, is asking them why. Why have you done this? Why have you thought this? Why do you think this has happened? And this is an important question because in quantitative research, we rarely are able to understand the reasoning behind a particular behavior, whereas qualitative research can tell us more about the insights that guide the participant into a particular behavior, opinion, etc. And then again, at the end, it's good to summarize as a way of checking your understanding. This can be done before you move on to a new topic in the interview, or at the end of the whole interview as well. There are, of course, also questions that you want to be able to avoid. This is closed questions, things that require a yes or no answer, things that are leading questions. So, you wouldn't want this, or do you mean that you only do X? Ones that are double-barreled, and that might be too complex to kind of unpack in a normal conversation, or ones that are biased. As researchers, we also often use jargon in our day-to-day activities, and we forget that when we interview participants, we need to get rid of that jargon and actually have a common language that everyone can understand. This is why it's really important to pilot your interviews and practice them, because we are usually not aware of whether we ask leading questions, closed questions, biased questions, or whether we used jargon. Having a friend listen to you and actively listen whether you ask these types of questions will be really good feedback for you when you conduct interviews. So to give you an example of an interview guide, I thought I'd present to you with one that I've done recently in a study. This was an interview that I conducted with students looking at the relationship between physical activity and mental health. And my interview guide included at the beginning a list of things that I needed to remember to bring for every interview. So my voice recorder, a survey that I'd ask participants to fill out at the beginning of the interview, my information and consent form, and a summary of the data that I had previously collected from participants through an app. I then wrote how I wanted to remind myself to get participants to fill out the information sheet and ask any questions if they had them, and then sign the consent form. Then I started the actual interview, but I started with very open-ended questions. So these were students. So I started with, what course are you doing? How long have you been at Northumbria? Do you live in student accommodation? Have you lived in Newcastle all your life? These are very easy questions that participants can answer comfortably. Then I move on to more detailed questions. Again, moving on to their phones. Again, these are a bit more generic. But then I asked them about the experience of this app that they had been using for a month, and looking through the data of the app, asked them, what did they use it as they expected? Did you like or dislike the app? If you could change anything, what would you change? You will notice that some of these questions are phrased as closed questions. This is not necessarily a good example of an interview guide, and you can think about how you would rephrase some of these questions in order for them to be more open-ended, for example. A different type of interview guide that I've used is a mind map that's color-coded. In this case, I was interviewing academics around their email use across different devices for work and personal reasons. And I started my interview by asking them about, I started from here, the inbox topic, where I asked them, I think I actually started from the accounts, where I asked them what kinds of email accounts they had, whether they were work or personal accounts. Then I asked them how I moved on to their inbox in terms of how they organized their inbox. So what strategies, for example, they used in order to go through new messages. Did they glance, scan, and defer? Did they triage, scan, archive, deal with an email, and search? And these were like prompts for me. Rather than writing the whole questions, there were keywords that I needed to remember in order to ask participants similar questions. This is a guide for a semi-structured interview. This is also a guide for a semi-structured interview. But what I like about the mind map is that I have all my questions on one page, and depending on how participants are following up on the conversation, I might skip from one topic to another topic, and it allows me to take notes next to the actual topic itself on what participants have said during the interview. One question I often get asked from students is, how many interviews should I do? And unfortunately, my answer is always, how long is a piece of string? Which is not very helpful. But the thing is that it really depends on your research question. It depends on the size of the relevant population, on resources constraints, and all sorts of different elements that go along with your sampling criteria. One thing, though, to keep in mind when doing interviews is that doing more doesn't necessarily mean having better data. And actually, the volume can undermine the depth and nuance of the analysis. Remember, the point is to get, as much as possible, a broad perspective of opinions, experiences, rather than actually quantify and maximize how many people experience certain things. So, now that we have a better idea of interviews, we can move on to focus groups. Focus groups are, in some respects, similar to interviews. They too are a conversation with a purpose, but this time the conversation, rather than being just a one-to-one between interviewer and researcher, it's a one-to-many. So the interviewer is interviewing a group of people. And this is an important distinction because our understanding of something is often constructed in interaction with others, which means that if we're taking part in a focus group, our opinions will be shaped by those that are in the group with us. Another distinction is that focus groups are moderated. They're moderated group discussions. This means that the group leads the discussion and the researcher is just there to moderate, make sure that the topics are covered, allow for different perspectives to emerge. But as part of the moderation process, there's also the need to take notice of group dynamics and ensure that everyone is feeling comfortable. So you would usually have 6 to 10 individuals within a focus group. And you might repeat different focus groups. So you might have 6 to 10 different groups of 6 to 10 different individuals, depending on your sampling criteria, your research constraints, sample size of your population, etc. How you recruit these, whether these are strangers or acquaintances, will depend, again, on what your research question is. Sometimes acquaintances are easier to recruit because you can get a friend to recommend another friend to come. You can recruit an existing group to come and take part in the focus group. And they also offer an insight into real group dynamics and how that specific group works. It will allow for a more comfortable flow because that group is more used to talking with one another. But that's maybe not always possible or ideal. So you can have focus groups with strangers. This might require more dynamic interactions. It might be less inhibited because people don't know each other, so they don't necessarily care about offending someone else or sharing their opinion. And there is also less taken for granted assumptions of what other people might think or feel. Again, should you have groups that are similar, with participants that are similar to one another or different to them? Homogeneous groups, so people that are more similar to one another, are generally more comfortable. There's a smoother flow in the conversation. There's a much greater disclosure. People will open up a lot more. Heterogeneous groups, so ones that are more different from one another, will capture diversity of perspectives, which doesn't necessarily get captured as much in similar groups. And people will bounce off of each other's and, again, take less for granted about what others think. So one good strategy here, again, depending on your research question, is to perhaps find a group that is homogeneous in background but heterogeneous in perspective. So this is, for example, the case of you recruit students who all have the student experience as similar in the background, but students from different departments or different faculties. So their experience of how they're learning will very much depend on the subject that they're graduating in, for example. One thing to consider in a group composition is power relationship and status relationships. So if you're interested in hearing about lower status individual, you want to avoid having a manager or someone that has high status or power over them in the same group. So think about the example of you're organizing a focus group to understand working practices in a factory to explore the idea of introducing robots. It's not a good idea to involve managers in that focus group because workers might feel that they're not free to discuss their concerns if they think their job is on the line. So in this case, you as a researcher will need to reassure the manager that it's in their best interest not to take part, especially if they insist in being there. and that you, because you're an impartial actor, will be able to report a summary of anonymized findings back to them, and get a more transparent, nuanced feedback from the workers. So, as a moderator, your role is very much to keep the conversation on focus and not make it turn into a generic chat. This is a particular risk, especially with groups that know each other. This is why you still have a topic guide or stimulus material, but bear in mind that you won't be able to stick to it as rigidly as you might in an interview. Also, because there's more people involved, you wouldn't have the same number of questions as a stimulus or a topic to probe participants. You would have a fewer number. And again, this is where piloting will help you understand how many questions or stimulus you need for a particular length of focus group. So again, your role is to make sure that the discussion stays on track. And the more participants you have, the harder this will be. Again, practice will help you. Get a bunch of friends, practice your focus group skills. The other role that you need to be aware of is making sure that individuals are all contributing, or more importantly, that there is no single individual that is over-contributing and preventing others from actually sharing their own opinion. One thing as well to keep in mind is that silence is not an enemy. You need to be able to accept silence. This is a time where participants will perhaps be thinking about an answer. They need time to elaborate. And silence is sometimes a really good thing. If you do think, though, that a group has stalled and is not able to kind of progress in the conversation, one strategy is to get them to write down ideas and then share them with the group. And that will hopefully then prompt more discussion on what was heard and shared between the group. What counts as kind of a topic for a focus group? Focus groups are generally used in political and market research, which means that they're less prone to be used on topics that are generally personal topics. Especially, it's not ideal to use them for sensitive issues, such as sexual criminal behavior, because people might not be willing to disclose that kind of information. It's also difficult because you might not be able to maintain anonymity or confidentiality. As much as you would in a focus group ask all participants who take part to not share anything that is discussed openly in the focus group beyond the walls of the focus group, there is no guarantee that the participants would have that kind of same integrity. However, an in-depth interview sometimes on a very personal topic might also feel intimidating or uncomfortable. So, in some respects, a group scenario can help diffuse this intensity. Again, it really depends on your research question and thinking about which is the most appropriate method to get an answer for your question. But one example for which focus groups are good is, for example, with vulnerable populations, where an interview may feel too invasive or threatening. There are some practical issues to consider when organizing a focus groups. The same kind of preparation applies to interviews as they do for focus groups. You still need to think about location, perhaps book a room, have information and consent forms, think about how you're going to record things. But they do require a lot more coordination because there are more people involved. And because of that, you should always over-recruit for a focus group. And the reason is people will drop out or they won't show up and they won't give you notice. So you want to still have enough people there to share opinions. Another challenge is being able to make sure that everyone is audible on a voice recording. Some alternatives are, for example, having 2 voice recorders at opposite ends of the room, so that even so no one's too far away from the voice recorder. But again, then the issue becomes, how do you match voices to people and participants? So another alternative is to have a video recording. Obviously, that means you have resource constraints. You might not have access to a video recorder, or it might make people uncomfortable. When I've done focus groups in the past, one thing I did was I'd have a voice recorder, and I also had a video recorder. And I told participants explicitly that I would not use the video recorder for anything else other than to help me in the transcription process, to help remember who was speaking when and distinguish voices. Some of the issues with focus groups are that, as you can tell, focus groups do not allow to get in depth into a particular narrative as much as an interview does. It also makes the analysis a bit more challenging because you need to think about, are you going to analyse on an individual level what individuals have said within focus groups, or as a group level? Again, that will depend on your research question, but also the type of analysis that you are using. Another challenge that comes with focus groups is that you might have one very dominant person that will sway the conversation in a particular direction. And that's again where moderation comes really in handy, because you need to be able to make sure that the conversation is equally balanced between participants. But at the same time, because we're in a group dynamic, people may distort or misinterpret their perspective because other people are silent, or because of how people are responding and reacting. So, should you do interviews or focus groups? Well, you need to bear in mind that, as we just said, how we think and how we behave will change in the presence of other people. This may be something that you're looking for, or it may not, and that will kind of help determine whether you should do interviews or focus groups. Focus groups help provide insights into the processes more than the outcomes. It's more about thinking about how things are happening. And again, what is it that you're more interested in? Both of them, though, do provide insight in how people experience and articulate the world. They do it at different levels. One is more about individual consciousness. So the interviews is more about how the individual is aware of these things. The other one is more about social dynamics and how these come into play. So as I've mentioned throughout this video, it really depends on the fit between what your research question is, the method, and how you plan to analyse the data. A few words of advice. So do remember and remind your participant as well that there are no right or wrong answers, both in focus groups and in interviews. It's just respondents' opinions. It's important that it's their opinion, though, and not yours, which means you should never give your own opinion on a topic, because this may bias them to give a response that will please you. So if a participant asks you, what do you think about topic X? You should always then deflect that and say, well, I'm here interested in your opinion. We can discuss this later after the interview is finished, for example, but for now I want to hear your opinion. Also, remember to ask questions that probe, but don't prompt a response. So this means saying things like, what do you mean by that? Rather than saying, do you mean X, Y, and Z? because again, you don't want to bias them into pleasing you. And again, don't let dominant personalities in focus groups steal the light and the discussion. Things that you don't want to do is you don't want to be talking. You should talk for a small proportion of the time and let the participants talk as much as possible. Again, don't ask leading questions and make sure that participants don't drift off the focus. This also means when it comes to interviews and focus groups, even in a non-structured interview, you still want to try to keep it on topic. At the same time, though, you want to make sure that you allow them to be flexible in their responses and you don't restrict them to answering just that specific question, but kind of give some context around that, for example. So you should now have a better understanding of what interviews and focus groups are and how they're different and how to conduct them.